In a brief introduction to Disco Elysium's ideology, the creator Ratat made an invitation to an anarchist reading of the game, and I decided to see if I could offer one relatively limited reading from an extremely diverse school of thought. For further clarification, I'm an anarchist with a particular interest in libertarian socialist, including mutualist, egoist, anarcho-communist, anarcho-syndicalist, municipalist, and anarcho-feminist tendencies. My most robust models of anarchism function around the egoist philosophy, elucidating a tool to, and at times goal of, to recognize all ideas as creative reflections of the unique/ego's existence, and because these ideas, feelings, goals, etc. are ultimately created by us, we should actively claim them as our property, to recognize that we are to use them any way that we choose in the pursuit of our self-interest. Then we should claim that these properties are our own, including truth, science, the cause for justice, the cause for peace, as not things that are fixed to us as to fit ourselves into, but as tools to enjoy the world that we actively create. From this fairly early on developed point of Max Stirner's egoism, anarcho-communism in the tradition of thinkers from Kropotkin to Graeber creates a model to show how our usage of property, or to avoid confusion in this case, ideas and social constructs, can radically change what kind of social relations are possible when we consider how systems and quote-unquote neutral activity within them will encourage the development and change of individuals' drives, capacities, and consciousnesses. I recognize I'm throwing a lot of jargon right out the gate, but I just want to make clear that with this base positionality, that I do not represent the entirety of anarchist thought, that especially given my leanings, I kind of encourage the use of a Marxist lens, which were largely covered in Ratat's video. After all, even in Disco Elysium, the anarchists fought alongside the communards. However, they were largely expunged likewise, and therefore my reading will be more focused on what anarchist principles are exhibited, as there are really no anarchists stated in the game. I think one of the best places to start to kind of see what I'm talking about is the Ravers kind of church disco side quest, what I ended up calling Disco Elysium. And what's interesting about it is that, it doesn't really note as any particular political action. It's not communist or moralist to help them or anything. And yet there's still a lot there. At least the way that I played it, it kind of felt like a collection of people who live in the margins of Martinez, whose already marginal existence gets to come together around shared space and shared need. Someone who is already in the building, and somebody who, is just doing tests on the building, someone who can fix something in the building, someone who can DJ. The logistics of organizing this dance party in this condemned church are assembled not through a particular coordinating authority or body, but through what Kropotkin might have called mutual aid, through spontaneous, non-coercive actions of people in proximity to pull what they have together and what they collectively need. Kropotkin's argument is not that this cooperation is a moral imperative that we must all immediately kind of relent to, or something to uphold, but that is just an evolutionary tendency, that there's a baseline to social life that precedes and exceeds any ideological framing of it, that this kind of, these ravers don't need a particular theory to understand them, even through Kropotkin, that this is just a way that nature kind of might present itself, or how people present themselves. And with that all, the game almost tells us as a footnote that this action held back the Pale for 4 years. We'll get back to this aspect of the Pale soon, but what I think is most consequential is I kind of want to linger on the Ravers themselves. Egghead, as the character that most people focus on, some might see him as politically rootless, maybe some as a kind of nihilist. Egghead is hardcore, right? But hardcore is not orthodox. He doesn't have a fixed political program that he's defending with subcultural credentials. When you talk to him, he's pretty, amenable to any politics. You can bring him to communism, you can bring him elsewhere to places that might not so much align with, pericarnassian love or whatever he says. But this kind of genuine connection that he's searching for with himself and with his kind of perception of the world, he kind of finds it almost religious, and that's why he kind of connects to the church, right? It's this kind of feeling of being there connected by the music, I think, right? And I think it's worth sitting with this in relation to someone like David Graeber, right? He's constantly pointing about how, cooperation in life is already everywhere, that it is in the informal economies of care and reciprocity that capitalism requires from us to function but refuses to acknowledge or compensate, right? The church is sometimes part of those sites, just as the ravers' church is part of that kind of function in society to them. The ravers are kind of practicing this degree of what Graeber might call baseline communism, from each according to their need, according to their ability. And this is kind of where Dolores Day might connect, in that the game is explicit that Harry's love for Dora has become confused with, this Dolores Day kind of symbol of liberalism that, once felt emancipatory, but this promise kind of fell apart, and yet, anarchism and communism, at least in the real world, grew out of it, but the tradition is broken in modern days. Dolores Day is shattered. But she's not gone, right? The church kind of holds not the institution, but the fundamental idea of liberal politics, that people matter and their needs are real, that the connection between them is inherently valuable, and Egghead, for all of his hardcore or whatever, right, is oriented towards that kernel. He's naive about politics. And some other ravers show considerably more political development and diversity of thought, just as you might in any subcultural community, but Egghead's kind of ideas I don't think are born out of cynicism. I think it's just kind of this pre-theoretical faith in the thing that he might feel that political theory is supposed to be about in the first place. And then, of course, there's Noid, where Egghead is, a lot more warm, politically formless. Noid has more of a rejection to fixed ideas than most. He's not exactly nihilistic. He is probably closer to egoistic in some sense, of recognizing that no ideology fully captures people, and that he's demonstrated to be critical of the gender binary, all these kinds of concepts in this full deconstructory way. And I think this is kind of related to how punk and how these kinds of alternative subcultures have existed in the real world. The relationship between anarchism and punk in the modern era is kind of inextricable. The kind of ideas that inform anarchism are kind of understood to be the base of punk. The kind of DIY ethic, the decentralized production of things, hostility to any institutional capture, beyond aesthetic, they are also this kind of organizational practice with some political content that I think is, to some degree built from real anarchist theorists such as, Emma Goldman, who's well known for kind of feeling that the joy of living is inseparable from revolutionary practice. And, in the same way that they kind of take this to a logical extreme, it's taken to a place of mass rejection by some, of being post-left in a way that rejects any kind of modern narrative as religious. And hardcore, especially with Noid, can sometimes feel like it has a similar tendency to become so deconstructive that it loses the capacity to discriminate between what it is even refusing, when everything is suspect, when every positive claim is potentially a trap. Sincerity itself can become evidence in naivete when you end up in a position where, Egghead demonstrates that fascism and communism can feel roughly equivalent. It's not because they are, but because the deconstruction has outrun their ability to discriminate between the things that affect them. Egghead will accept the communist framing if you offer it persuasively, but, I don't think that means that the church itself is really that communist. I think it's basically more so saying that these are the people who have correctly intuited that fixed ideas are dangerous and to kind of be more self-owning, but they have not yet developed the tools to distinguish, at least to a degree that most anarchists would kind of like, or at the very least historical, theoretical anarchists, to distinguish between ideas worth dissolving and the ones worth defending. And this is not too also dissimilar from how some read Stirner. Stirner's egoism is often misread as the same pure deconstruction as a reduction of all concepts to phantasms, that to free our ego, we must free it from every idea. But that reading misses, the creative nothing that Stirner writes about, this kind of constructive dimension. The unique is not just pure negation, it creates the unique claimed property, not to be free from all relations, but to enter any of them freely. You might think of somebody like Marie Pickchin, who's, said that social ecology pushed precisely the individual dead end of certain anarchist tendencies. It made this kind of... It pushed them to the point of realizing that freedom is not the absence of social relations, but their transformation often through them and the community that the self is constituted by. So what the church kind of gets right is not Egghead's just deconstructed impulse, but rather this sincere self-ownership, in addition to kind of working with others in recognizing their uniqueness, is that Graeber would kind of identify this with direct action in a way, of that they're not thinking of a world to be, there's a willingness to act through the world as though you're already free. To talk about Everard Clare for a moment, he's pretty demonstrably not a communist as far as I would consider. He uses the language, talks about the workers, the union, the struggle. What he's advancing is something closer to social democracy, the consolidation of institutional power within these structures, the use of labor organizing as a base for his own personal authority, which is a common critique that we could see with someone as far back as Rudolf Rocker, with the unions of both his and our days, that we can kind of view through anarcho-syndicalism, that many unions kind of capture the same logic of capital and become obstacles to the very emancipation they represent by kind of becoming the working class's new management as a vanguard. Everard is that risk. He'll help you if you serve him. He'll, knock people off if the math works out for him, but his relationship is ultimately one of, kind of paternalistic power. He's deciding what they need. This is not to say that he's a villain, but that it kind of illuminates what horizontal organizing looks like in contrast with regard to Disco Elysium. It shows why the people who claim to be communist right now, one among many, of why they aren't the ones pushing back the Pale, even though they have great ideas. Speaking of the Pale, the Pale is described as this achromatic, featureless transition state into nothingness. The Encyclidian Phasmid itself kind of describes it to us as saying that nobody remembers where it came from before people. That likely means that we made it. And that is confirmed by a lot of other sources, that the Pale is something that humanity is doing to the world. And that, this is described by a lot of different kind of philosophies and science. Some people kind of describing how the Pale goes into this degree of degrading information and memory bleeding into the world. The inframaterialist kind of describe it as this thing that revolution must continue to counter against, as something that they believe they're able to push back via bringing about plasm into the world, via the revolutionary struggle, believing so deeply in communism, so much as Mazov and what's his name, Nilsson, were talking to each other and their minds while drinking tea or whatever, right? Like this collective consciousness that they assert has a relationship to the Pale's behavior, and that is, ultimately true. What I want to argue is not that inframaterialism is, entirely right or wrong, but that it has the right intuition, that something held back that plaza, that held back the Pale inside of the church. And for all we know, it could be a kind of plasm. It could be not an accumulation of revolutionary fervor, but people dancing, that at some level kind of did the same thing that the church before it was doing in containing it. My hypothesis is that the Pale is ultimately a consequence of humanity's collective alienation from its own consciousness. That not alienation in a vague kind of psychological sense, but in the Marxist sense, of saying that when we understand ourselves under certain hierarchies and via social reproduction, that the systems kind of sever us from our own bodies, from our labor, from our capacity for communal life, and they present that all as natural. The Pale is what civilization looks like when this systematic frustration for mutual aid, when fixed ideas have colonized experience so completely that no one can distinguish themselves from their ideological function, is when Pale happens. And yet there's all this kind of misunderstanding about what the Pale is, that kind of leads people to be almost nostalgic for the Pale as a representation of both kind of the past and the future, that they could either seclude themselves off from, and in doing so kind of obsess about them, or outright obsess about them. And in the process of doing this, we have ideas like entropilism, the faith in accelerating the Pale towards humanity's rest state, to evacuate the present. When, they drop a bomb on Revachol, in the process of doing so, I think that makes the Pale expand faster. That it's the process of ideology eating itself, when politics just give up on the present tense. And in doing so, I think this is where Krasmasov is right, in the same way that Marx is right about praxis, and that the Pale retreats when praxis, present tense cooperative life, expands, when the communist formula is applied from each according to their ability to each according to their needs, within free association, within the golden rule, when it is not entirely just a description of economic arrangement, but of what human life already looks like when it's functioning. And the fast bit implies, the best way to maximize that, to find that, for as many people, is through the workers' plight, is by, to the people that are doing most of the work already for keeping life going and carrying on. And so for these ones whose present tense cooperative activity is the antidote to the Pale, that means that something about the Pale is suppressed when replaced with a non-alienated kind of identity, or performance, or understanding, or even just consciousness, right? And the thing about this, right, is that the moral intern can't do this. As much as they pretend to be in control of it all, that control prevents them from fixing the problem. Their neutral liberal gaze above it all keeps them from being in the kind of relations that can hold the Pale back in this understanding. They can't push back this dissolution from a gunship, they can only do it by making connections with people in the mess. And to kind of step a little further too, I want to talk about Harry, because Harry is kind of the game's most sustained meditation on what happens to a self that has tried to escape itself, and then come back reclaiming all of those things without reconstructing the same prison. Now, Harry tried to forget, right? To entirely dissolve his ego, likely via knowing too much about the Pale and using it to kind of clear his mind. And while I don't, advocate that, I think it shows us something very interesting, and it's that the condition of becoming somebody, when he wiped it all out, he could begin to choose. He had no strong fixed ideas. It was purely kind of based on what the player representing Harry's creative potential is. We have so many tools to help us discover and form our identity as our own property, but what's crucial is that the game does not kind of let this even imagine for a moment that this happens by ourselves. It happens in relation to others, to Kim. Clearly this worldview does not, exalt Kim as someone who is ideologically strong, but we learn so much from Kim. Kim at times does a lot of, basic communism with us. And it helps Harry's consciousness develop. Harry cannot become himself alone. Obviously, one of the difficult things about this is that ultimately we have a limited set of responses to how we get to build ourselves in Disco Elysium. Harry can be many things, but not anything, right? Like, this game reproduces the conditions that it kind of describes. It, in a lot of ways, is a little bit of the same animal that Harry didn't want to be before the game, a bit of a psychic prison in which fixed ideas have already shaped the terrain before any of us arrived. All the options are constrained. Capitalism, patriarchy, the RCM, the failed revolution are all structures we just can't opt out of. And yet, I think what's amazing about the game in that it kind of has this anarchist spirit, in that despite this restriction, you can still live as though you're already free. In the act of choosing, even from limited options, in a more of a Stirnian sense, the act of saying, this is mine, this is who I am deciding to be, has this kind of self-determination that allows you through the game to feel as though your choices matter, as they do matter to you now. In that kind of sense, acknowledging that Disco Elysium is limited and it's a game, the most anarchist thing about it is that it kind of builds the relations it wants you to feel inside the medium itself, without requiring the medium to be free in the first place, kind of inspiring us to do the same. Harry at his, kind of best went through a disillusion and came out the other side, not reconstructed as the same cop, but as somebody entirely different, someone with capacity for connection as his own, not as something that governed him, his intelligence as his own, not as something that governed him, his grief, volition, all these things as tools to be used. And if he did that, then he would not be the man that he forgot. He'd be more than an animal that he didn't want to be. He could be an animal that he chooses to be, that's awake and honest about his needs, that can organize horizontally with other animals, something like the church, and produce something that can push back the pale, ideally through the worker's plight, but ultimately it's this larger process of connecting us to the means of society and politics through ourselves and through any kind of relation we engage in. That is the basis of anarchism, and what I felt was the most interesting thing about Disco Elysium is that it allows you to feel that and make that the driving kind of mechanism of how the game unfolds. The most radical thing about Disco Elysium is that despite its structure, is that you can still play Disco Elysium as though you are already free. And if you do so, the world changes.
Now imagine if we could do that, right? But with like 1,000 people. End of human development. Mission complete. I would.